Thanks, Eric. I also, for 9 years while I was at Gordon Conwell, I pastored a small Presbyterian church in Nashua, New Hampshire. It's called the Gate City because it's right there on the border with Massachusetts. Often did hospital visits at the University of Lowell. So we were right across the border from Massachusetts in that place there. I don't really recommend that a person teach a full load at a graduate school like Gordon Conwell while pastoring a church. I was 6'2" when I started that, and it took a little toll after a few years on me. But I do sympathize with fellow ministers. You know, Christian fellowship is one of the great consolations of living in a fallen world. And then one small sub-category of Christian fellowship is ministerial fellowship. Ministers know that they've been in the same trenches in many ways. They have some of the same scars and the same wounds, none of which they can talk about with their congregants, of course. And so ministers always enjoy their particular fellowship with one another, so it's good to be with you for those various reasons. I've entitled this from the Shema. You know, there's several different branches of Judaism, Reformed Judaism, sort of Orthodox, and the really Hasidic. But they all start in their liturgy, early in the liturgy, they always have the Shema from Deuteronomy 6. It's a part of their service. Ordinarily, it'll be done in Hebrew. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad is what they all do. And we normally remember the part that follows that, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and your soul, and your mind, and your strength. But it starts with "Hear, O Israel," right? Yahweh actually demanded their attention. And as the maker of the universe and all that's in it, and as the one who had recently delivered them from 430 years of bondage in Egypt, he had every right to seek their attention. And so he did. You may recall, some of you, that I think it was as early as 1998, students of the American Circumstance referred to our current economic circumstances as the attention economy. That what is being bought and sold is not coal, nor primarily gasoline and those kinds of things. It's not wool, it's not cotton, it's attention. And so that has only multiplied since then. And so we live in a culture where if we can think 60 years earlier to the painting on a Saturday Evening Post, you can imagine those kind of very quaint paintings of American culture. And I think I recall one at one time. A woman was in her kitchen, and she was surrounded by 2 or 3 small children. One was tugging on her skirt this way, and another was grabbing this way, and a third was needing attention for some sort, plus she had a pot that was hot, and she had to deal with that. And there she was, you know, too many people demanding attention, and she was only one human, right? Well, that would be a relaxing life now for most of us, because we're all far more harried than the woman in such a painting would have been. So ours is an attention economy, and not everyone soliciting our attention is the maker of heaven and earth. And not everyone who solicits our attention did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. And so there is one who's very worthy of our attention, and there are many others who are less worthy of our attention, and yet they're very eager to have it. So I want to say a little bit about a background before these 4 Roman numeral points in here. A background or a conversation in both cultural anthropology and what is now called media ecology. People used to ask me what courses I taught at Grove City College, and I didn't want to bore them by telling them it's 3rd and 4th semester Greek, right? That makes people terrified. But if I said media ecology, you could just see them roll their eyes as though they were thinking, oh, don't let that little man say another word, right? Because it's such an unappetizing label, right? Media ecology, yuck. It's not the kind of a label that gets your attention. But the expression was apparently coined by Marshall McLuhan at Toronto, and his protege, Neil Postman, who taught at NYU for many years, passed away in 2003, Postman endorsed the term, and there is now a Media Ecology Association in the United States. And so that is the term that has been used. And Postman says it's a good term. It's not just a bad term because it sounds unappetizing. Postman's argument was an ecologist studies environments. And when they study environments, their point is when you introduce a new species, you do not have the same environment plus the species. That species changes the whole environment. So I was snowshoeing in northeastern Vermont with one of my sons-in-law about 5 weeks ago, I suppose it was. And back when we lived in New England, I would get to that cabin several times a year, sometimes in the summer, but also in the winter. This time it was hard, by the way. They had a lot of snow in the Northeast, and we were on the North Trail this time because Champion International is lumbering the south side. The sun doesn't hit the north side of a mountain. And so the snow was deep. And even with snowshoes, we were sinking into our waist. And even Buddy, who's 6'1", was sinking to his waist too, right? So it was arduous work. It's normally a 2-hour trip. It took us 5 hours and 20 minutes. It was a really, really demanding thing. But I noticed several years ago when I was up there that I saw what I thought were moose footprints in the snow, because the moose are so long-legged, they actually stay out and move around some in the winter, unlike many other species. And then as I got closer to them and looked down into them, they were shaped like a cat's paw. So I said, oh, I guess we've got mountain lions back in the North Country up there. And so I had to be on the alert a little bit when I saw them. And still the numbers of them in northern Vermont and New Hampshire are very small. And so they haven't had a great ecological effect yet. But they will eventually, if they become more numerous, they will eventually affect the whole ratio of predator and prey. That's just the way it is. Ecological, environmental change changes everything. And so when you introduce a new species, in this case the mountain lion, you do not have the same forest you used to have plus a mountain lion. You have a different forest altogether. The mountain lion will prey on some, probably will not be predated on, but it will be a predator, right? And so it will alter things. So Postman says the idea of media ecology, he says it's actually a good expression. It teaches us to think about which parts of the human environment are influenced by the very media that we employ. What kind of humans does it nurture? What kinds of humans does it produce? And so the study of media ecology is the study, ordinarily with a small historical part up front, of the way media have changed through human civilization and how different media cultivate different humane traits, so that we can then think about those traits, which ones we would prefer to have, which ones we prefer not to have, and make intelligent choices about our own environment ourselves. So I say that this background exists in cultural anthropology and in media ecology, because cultural anthropology is an older discipline, media ecology is a newer discipline, and I regard it as a subspecies of cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropologists look at the various tools that societies use, and they can recreate an ancient civilization by the tools they discovered. And so they know whether they fished or not, whether they hunted or not, they know whether they were agricultural or not, and they look at the tools, and then they reconstruct from the tools that they discover what they were like. Well, media ecology is a small subset, you might say, therefore, of cultural anthropology, looking not merely at hunting tools and agricultural tools, but looking primarily at the media humans use to convey what they know about the culture and world around them. And so the famous thesis of all cultural anthropologists is, we make tools and tools make us. We shape tools and tools shape us. So there is this reciprocity that the human makes tools ordinarily for particular purposes, and then finds that the tool has other effects than the intended ones. So when I added the first room to our house in Massachusetts close to 40 years ago, now I suppose it was, I added a deck on also. And when I was getting ready to dig the holes for the sonotubes to put the concrete in, to put the footers out there, it was a 14 by 10, and so 14 against the house and 10 feet this way. And I wanted it to be square. Nothing looks worse than a deck that's not square, because it's so easy to see that it's not square. So you're really careful when you put the foundation in because you want it square. So running the 2 strings out at 10 feet and then they're connected at 14, obviously I could have ended up with a trapezoid, the very thing you don't want in a deck. And so I kept occasionally putting the 2 sticks in out there and then measuring the diagonals. And it didn't matter what the absolute number was on the diagonals. The point was, when the diagonals were identical, it was square. And so at some point, I had the posts where I wanted them in the ground, and it was time to start digging. And my wife came out and said, "What are you making?" And I said, "Calluses." Right? So I was also making a hole in the ground, but in the process, I was making calluses. Now, that's not a value judgment. Calluses can be very useful. I haven't played handball in 20 or 30 years, I don't think, but in college I played with some regularity. If you play handball, you want the hardest hands you can possibly get, because the ball will come off of that hand a lot faster if it's hitting a hard surface than if it has a soft surface. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have calluses. It could be a good thing. The point is, when you use a shovel, it's likely to develop calluses, unless you have a good pair of leather work gloves or something like that. And so the cultural anthropologists have been saying this for literally centuries. We make tools and tools make us. We make them for one purpose, and we find that they do other things. Now, I know none of you has ever done this, because you look like a very intelligent and smart group. But rumor has it that some people in the history of our race have opened a paint can with a screwdriver. I know none of you would have ever done that, right? The screwdriver is designed to drive screws. And they make a little tool that you can buy at any paint store that's designed to open these things. But what happens is, we make the tool to drive screws, and we find that we can also open paint cans with it. And sometimes that doesn't work well. I had to take a screwdriver back to the Sears in Philadelphia when I was doing graduate studies there. I went in sheepishly and said to the man behind the counter, I said, "Does Craftsman still have a lifetime warranty on a tool that breaks?" He looked at it and says, "Yes, even if it was broken by someone opening a paint can." I was just so despondent at that point, because he had figured me out, right? That I had misused the tool, and that's why it was broken. So that's the nature of our reciprocity with our tools. We make tools, and then they make us. So Marshall McLuhan coined the term media ecology to help us think about which media that we have shape our environment in what ways, and what kind of humans that produces. And so it's an awkward, unappetizing term, but I still think it's a useful term, and I'm glad that that's the term that they use. It's also a very new discipline. When I began teaching media ecology in the fall of 2003, by the way, within 2 or 3 months of my teaching it, Professor Walter Ong at St. Louis University passed away, and he taught media ecology there. And Professor Postman at NYU also passed away, as they had to leave the world if I was now teaching media ecology. They wanted nothing to do with it, and both went away. But when I started teaching it, the people that I know in the Media Ecology Association said at the time, fall of 2003, mine was the only undergraduate course on media ecology in the United States. Now, Postman was teaching it at the graduate level at NYU, and of course, they still had people at Toronto following Marshall McLuhan's leadership, and they had a graduate program there. But it's such a new discipline that mine was the first course, apparently, in North America at the undergraduate level. And so it was a very fascinating thing to do. On the back, you'll see in smaller print a partial bibliography related primarily to what we're talking about tonight, attention, and it represents maybe 1/10 of the bibliography for that course. And I left beside the names of many of these authors parenthetically what they did. There are behavioral economists, psychologists, there are sociologists, there are professors of education, and so forth. One of the fascinating things at this point, because it's a new discipline, is it hasn't yet been ruined by some administrator. In fact, at this point, we don't even know if it belongs on the STEM side of the campus, right, with the sciences and engineering and so forth, or does it belong on the humanities side? Because the people, as you can tell by just looking at what they do, it's the most interdisciplinary thing that there could possibly be, and that's why it's such a delight to work in that field and to study that sort of material. It's a very, very nimble discipline at this point. It hasn't been forced into some mold. I think it's in the nature of university administrators that they think the whole world is Jell-O and they need to put it in a mold to shape it the way they want it to be. And what they often end up with is a wreck, a real train wreck. But right now it's still a very delightful place to read because it is so multiple disciplinarity. So what we want to talk about a little bit is attention. And so I start there in your first Roman numeral with a discussion of neurogenesis. And you'll note that I parenthetically indicate some authors call this neuroplasticity, emphasizing that the brain's synaptic pathways constantly change. Others call it neurogenesis because the brain creates its own pathways. So the two terms do not convey a different thing. They have the same referent, and some people refer to it by the term neuroplasticity, and the other the term neurogenesis. We had two breakthroughs about 25 years ago. As you know, scientific revolutions take place normally according to two kinds of things. According to Thomas Kuhn, when you have a change in paradigm, you have sudden breakthroughs in certain disciplines because we now look at everything differently. The paradigm by which we view it has changed. And that happened about 25 years ago, because prior to that, the predominant and prevailing view in neurobiology was that the brain is wired by 5 years old. And there are only 2 or 3 objectors to that. One of them here in the United States, I think he was at the University of Chicago, but there were 1 or 2 people here in the United States who said, no, that's just not true. The brain continues to develop. But the whole discipline functioned as though the brain was fully wired by the time you were roughly 5 years old. And so the paradigmatic change that took place roughly at the turn of the millennium, a little before, is that now everyone recognizes that the brain's constantly changing. And part of the reason is if paradigms change disciplines, the other thing that changes disciplines is tools. Before you have telescopes, astronomy just can't do but so much. If you don't have a microscope, microbiology can't do but so much. So with the development of the fMRI, you could actually look at what's going on in the brain while the person is still alive. Used to be you had to wait for a person to die, which could be inconvenient for the person who's volunteering for this task, and you had to remove, and you could say, well, I know what a dead brain does, nothing, right? But you had no way of measuring what's going on in living tissue. Now we do. And so you had a change in paradigm, the belief that the brain constantly rewires itself, and the ability to see that it's happening. And now they can actually see it. So they can do an fMRI on you, and then have you come back 6 months later, and your brain is mapped out differently. And you know, hundreds of things could figure into that. You can do controlled studies where one group listens to Schumann for 6 months and the other listens to Tate, and to see what happens with their brains. And I guarantee you they would be different brains. I'm not saying one would be better than the other. I'm just saying that Taylor Swift and Schubert do different things with music. It's music, right? But what they do with music is very, very different. And so you would have a different neurology from being exposed, let's say, an hour a day to Schubert versus an hour a day to Taylor Swift. That's just the way it would be. And so this is a fascinating field, and I think actually if I were advising young people today, high school age students, I would say enter neurobiology. It's the most fascinating field today. It's just an unbelievably rich field. There's stuff being discovered all the time because once they had the tool and once the paradigm changed, once they realized that the brain is constantly creating new synaptic pathways, it has opened the doors to enormous amounts of fascinating research as we understand human behavior better armed by that. So our brain is very, very flexible. It's very, very plastic. And it adjusts to what it needs to adjust to. So I think I mentioned here the example of children reared in different cultures just as quickly learn their language, right? They hear it. They hear the cadences, the sounds, right? So an 11-year-old boy in Paris today is probably speaking French. And an 11-year-old boy in Pittsburgh today is speaking something approximating English. There's that Western Pennsylvania angle on it, which is a little odd, but it's still close to English, right? And had he grown up somewhere else, he would have had a different English than Pittsburghese, right? He wouldn't have said yens and these kinds of things. What happens is those children learn these kinds of things because they're exposed to them, and the brain adjusts to what it needs to adjust to. If you had bought a baseball glove for a son or a grandson or a nephew or a niece, and if you threw softballs into it routinely, it would adjust to and shape itself to the softball. If you threw hard balls, it would adjust to the hard ball because the leather would adjust to what it needs to adjust to. And our brains are that way too. They adjust because of what they're exposed to. So what happens is the brain's firing electric energy all the time, and sort of without much direction, the way lightning seems to be undirected. Now, I'm not denying that the Lord might have something to do with it. I'm just saying that from our points of view, it seems pretty random, right? Electricity just goes off and does its thing. But apparently, when a part of the brain finds that spark useful, it's like hiking through the forest on a trail versus hiking through by breaking your own trail. So in the little forest over here down off of Denison Run Road, so just a few miles south of us, is where I normally spend my free time. And I like to just bush my way around from time to time and get off the paths. There's 50 miles of trail in that forest. But the wildlife they don't like being near the trails because there are humans. And the humans are noisy, right? And they're distracting and so forth. And so there are parts of that lovely little forest that you can't really see unless you go off trail. And so I do a lot of bushwhacking where I just go off trail and say, I'm heading this direction. There's the wonderful view of the Allegheny from the overlook there that some of you have been to. You know how pretty that view is. And if I'm out there in the afternoon, normally I just walk back without the trail because the parking lot is roughly southwest of the Denison Run overlook. And so I just walk towards the sun, and I always find myself within 40 or 50 yards of the parking lot. And then I see all sorts of things I wouldn't because I'm making my own paths. Well, the brain makes its own paths. When the brain finds a spark useful and kind of holds on to it, as it were, for a second, and keeps doing that, before long, now you've got a pathway between the different lobes. I think there are 5 lobes in the brain, 3 of whom need to connect in order for you to learn language, none of which are connected when you're born. And so the reason it took so long to learn to read, if you can recall those days, it wasn't because it was conceptually complex or difficult the way the fundamental theorem of the calculus is probably difficult. It was that your brain couldn't do it. You had to connect the conceptual lobe, you had to connect the visual and the auditory, because you had to see things, sound them out, and then once you sounded them out, they became words that were familiar to you because the concepts associated with them had already been done through uncles and aunts and grandparents and parents and so forth. And so the reason it takes so long is because the brain is not ready to do it yet. But it does, in most cases, learn how to do it. Now, dyslexia is a problem, and some people, their brain does not ever develop a very efficient way of doing this, but most brains will do so. And so what we call learning then is not merely extrinsic to us, objective to us. It's not merely we're learning about something, but we're also sharpening our own faculties of knowing. We normally think about the first, but not the second. But every athlete knows that the musculature of the human body can be developed. At my age, it doesn't develop as rapidly as it did when I was younger, but it still develops, and still there's some benefit from exercise and so forth. And so it's the same way with the brain, and so the brain can be shaped to do things. So I mentioned a couple completely erroneous things that I'm sure that you've heard, and I've heard many times before. I've heard people say there's a distinction between visual learners and auditory learners, right? as though this were canonical, right? When in actual fact, the people who did the first initial study on this 40 years ago actually were studying only one very, very small aspect of learning, and that's what we call recall. So one aspect of learning is what we call recall, when we recollect something. And so what they were doing is they were testing groups with random sequences of letters or numbers, like 4, 8, 9, 2. And they found that with some people, they scored 5 or 6 points higher on a scale of 100 when they saw the information, and others a little higher when they heard it. But it was only 4 or 5 points on a scale of 100, right? It was a very, very small difference in them, and had they been exposed routinely to the alternative, their brain would have rewired itself, and they would have learned that way also. So it's the whole idea of learning, that it has to be visual or it has to be auditory and so forth. When people say to me, well, I'm a visual learner, I say, well, boy, are you lucky that you weren't around in the days of Jesus, because he didn't have any audio-visual aids, right? My guess is the disciples learned a good deal from him, right? They called him teacher, so I suspect he was a pretty good teacher. And yet he had no PowerPoint slides, right? I don't know how he got through without it, but he managed to get through without PowerPoint slides, right? So you can learn anything that you want to learn. And certain things are helpful visually, I think. And if we find that they're helpful, we use them. Certain things are helpful auditorily. We take our little snippet from, is it Brahms or Mozart, to teach our children the alphabet. We start by singing songs with them, right? Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder, right? And then we do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Take that one little thing, you see, and it helps to learn. You've got the musical melody that stays with you, and you put the stuff on there, and it goes on very nicely. So we're constantly figuring this to be the case. So you've heard people say, and one of my daughters, I won't embarrass which one, but one of my daughters used to say, I'm not good at math. And I said, honey, how about just indulging your old dad once and say, I'm not real good at math today. You might be real good at math later. And so the brain will learn how to learn what it needs to learn. And we needn't consign ourselves to a perpetual imbecility, I suppose, because the brain will learn what it needs to. Now, before they had the fMRI, and before the breakthroughs now in neurobiology, media ecologists already understood the phenomenon, but they didn't understand it biologically. They knew it phenomenologically. And they used to say the sensoria are plastic. You'll see this in media ecologists from the 1970s. They would say the sensoria are plastic or flexible. They're not fixed and determined. And they used the word sensoria because they were talking about 7 things, not 5. Had they used the word senses, we would have thought of sight and smell and taste and touch and sound. But for them, the sensoria is a cluster of those 5 senses, and then the 2 properties of the mind. And whatever labels have been applied historically to that, the 2 properties of the mind that all cultures have recognized are the rational faculty and the imaginative faculty. They're analogous to the brakes and the accelerator in the automobile. That the imaginative faculty is the faculty of the brain that figures things out that hadn't been figured out before. This gets very busy at night during rapid eye movement sleep, right? Once the rational part of the brain is not holding your brain back, it goes nuts with imagination, doesn't it? And you wake up some mornings recalling half or a snippet of the last dream, and you're going, man, I'm not going to tell anyone that one. That's just crazy. And so since the Enlightenment, I would guess the West tends to value the rational over the imaginative. But from all of human history, from Adam until the Enlightenment, the imaginative faculty was very highly prized, because that's when you learn to make suspension bridges, right? Someone comes up with something that's never been come up with before. And we admired people who had creativity or imagination. And now I think the tide has shifted to where we tend to prize the rational faculties more than the imaginative. They both just do different kinds of things for us to do. So if we have these attentive properties, the five senses and the two properties of the mind, then it seems to me that the people who study this are right in saying at this point we can distinguish three kinds of attention. Three different kinds of attention: alarming attention, orienting attention, and executive attention. Now, some people call alarming attention alerting attention. It's the same thing. It's just two different words for the same reality. So if the DCNR releases a deer into the forest over here, and maybe it had been wounded by an automobile accident, and it's been healed, and a month and a half later they return it to the forest. When he gets into the forest, his nose is really active. His ears are really active. We don't notice how big the deer's ears are because they're lovely creatures in so many other ways. But their ears are nearly as large as a rabbit's ears. I mean, they have big ears, right? And they smell wonderfully and they hear wonderfully. And of course, most of those species, if they are released into the woods, they're sniffing around for water, right? Now humans, if we're looking for water, we go downhill. One of our ancestors learned a long time ago that that's how gravity works. And so if you're this side of the Missouri River, if you're thirsty, just go downhill and you'll find water. And even if it's not very good water and it has some microorganisms in it, you won't get ill from it for probably 9 or 10 days. And so whether you die from not having any water in you, or whether you get an intestinal bug of some sort that requires treatment later, it's still better to get the water in there and not die of thirst because you don't want that to happen. But the deer, his orienting attention goes nuts as soon as he's out in the forest. He's all ears, as it were. He's Ross Perot on steroids. And so he's all about smelling and listening to see what's going on around him. And the species that survive in the forest have profound alarming or alerting attention because they have to, right? They're in this constant balance of predator and prey. And so they have to find their own prey and they have to avoid being someone else's prey, right? And so the Native Americans taught us when the Europeans came here and got into these big forests and so forth, and they told us, if it doesn't break a twig, you needn't be worried about it. And so when I spend nights in the forest alone, I was very nervous about when I first did it. I realized, no, if it doesn't break a twig, it's not big enough to do me any harm. In fact, most of the times when I'm out there, I put little shooting plugs in. And that way I don't get awakened all night long by some of the small creatures that pop around out there and just make racket, right? So I don't want them to awaken me. And in October, when the acorns are falling, like they did last year, and you hear tick, 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 boom, tick, 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 right? And you can't get to sleep. So I put the plugs in, and I've decided, it's going to have to be one big, rowdy animal to be a threat. And at that point, I'll probably have an instrument with me that has a 4 on the front of it, of some sort, 45, 44, 41, and we'll handle the matter that way. So what the human has that the others don't, we also have alarming attention, we have orienting attention, but we have executive attention. And if you're going to learn the American Republic, and what were the kinds of things in the Federalist Papers that Madison and Hamilton and Jay were wrestling with to try to figure how to frame a republic that had the best aspects of the Athenian and Roman republics and avoided the worst parts of their drawbacks. And so to understand that, and why did they designate representation in Congress with every state gets 2 in the Senate, and then in the House of Representatives, depending upon the latest census and the population of that state, they get fewer or more representatives there by population. They thought through all those kinds of things, and they deliberately designed what we call checks and balances, right? And so in the last month and a half or 2 since Mr. Trump's been back in office, we've seen a lot of checks and balances going on, haven't we? Those who like what Mr. Trump is doing or don't like it when the judges tell him it's unconstitutional. Those who dislike what he's doing, they're all pro-judge right now, right? They've got someone putting him back on his horse. And so that's the way our republic is supposed to work. The legislative, the executive, and the judicial are supposed to interact with one another. You could say that the original founding fathers designed an inefficient government. They wanted it not to get on a downhill slope and be going too fast. They wanted to be lots of things in there to check it from its worst excesses. Because even when we use the term government fairly neutrally, or if we're theologians, we call it the civil magistrate, a neutral term. What we call the government is a group that is authorized to tax us, to fine us, to incarcerate us, and to execute us. Doesn't seem so neutral now, does it? Right? Now, if there's a group out there that can tax Gordon, can fine Gordon, can incarcerate Gordon, can execute Gordon, do I want that thing to run efficiently or inefficiently? Inefficiently. Right? The more inefficient in some sense, the better. But you see, that requires a certain amount of executive attention to think through why the Federalist Papers contained the papers they did. Why did they address the topics they did, trying to persuade the 13 colonies to embrace this Constitution? Jay and Hamilton and Madison came up with reasoning and argumentation behind what they had designed, trying to persuade people that it was a good way to go. And we call that executive attention. None of the other creatures has it, only the human has. And so while the other creatures are a part of God's created order and they serve many very good purposes, we alone have executive attention. And as we will see, one of the challenges facing us is there's been a serious decline in executive attention since the digital world began. The digital world has really been a problem for us. So if you look back at the top of your first page, let me just race you through the history of media, right? That little group where the original medium was always orality. Humans could speak long before they developed any abilities to write. They spoke. And so the earliest and universal human medium is orality or speech. And then after about a 5-century effort, 3,000 years ago, they began to develop writing, script. And we call it chirography. And we do so because it's derived the same way the Latin manuscript and the English handwriting, right? They are all the same thing in some sense, right? One's just a Greek word, hierography. The other is manuscript. The other is handwriting. But the reason media ecologists use the old term is because remember, in 3,000 years ago when they were writing, they were etching letters into animal skin or into papyrus. Very different than having a smooth piece of paper and a fountain pen today and just gliding across it. So if we called it handwriting, what that would say to people is this kind of thing that we do so easily. But if we use an ancient word from an ancient language and call it chirography, it reminds people that what they called chirography was something that very few people could even do. Prior to the printing press, for instance, the estimates are that very few civilizations in the West had a literacy rate of over 3%. 97% were illiterate. Because when you're writing on animal skins, right, it's so expensive to produce a manuscript, so labor-intensive and goat-intensive, right, that it just takes a long time to get the thing done. They say that if you copied in the first century a Greek New Testament, it would require the equivalent of 40 Roman centurions' annual wage, right? So a centurion, as the name suggests, had command over roughly 100 troops, hence the name centurion. But probably it was closer to 85, and you had some administrative people in there with him. But this would have been the equivalent of maybe a major today. So it wouldn't have been a buck private, wouldn't have been a sergeant, wouldn't have been a first lieutenant, probably would have been somewhere in the category of a major. Now, my guess is the typical major in the armed forces today probably has a salary of close to $60,000 or $70,000 and free housing on campus, and free meals, and free clothing, right? So really, if he were a private citizen, we put all that together and say, it's probably $100,000. And if it would take 40 of those So now you're talking serious money, right? $4 million to have a Greek New Testament, right? That's what it would have cost. So then the real breakthrough that we all know about, of course, is the printing press in the 15th century. With the printing press, you can print a sheet, print it again, and of course, what made the printing press work was not just the materials that they used to do the machine, but a process of inventing inexpensive paper. Because if you were still printing on goat skins, right, it would have still been too expensive to have ever been affordable for average human beings. So at that time, they had figured out the emulsification process and how to make what we would call today paper. And so the printing press changed everything. Within 150 years of the development of the printing press, they say that 85% of Europe was illiterate. And prior to it, it was 2 to 3%. So literacy was what scribes did. If you were a monk, you might be in a monastery somewhere, and one of your jobs would be to copy ancient manuscripts. Some of them, when they were Latin speaking, were copying Greek manuscripts, and they couldn't read Greek, and they couldn't translate Greek, but they could form the letters. And you say, well, why would you want a job like that? Well, it was better than mucking stables, to be honest, right? And so if you're a monk, you're either going to work in the kitchen, baking bread of some sort, you're going to muck stables, cleaning up after the animals, who haven't figured out how to use modern toilets, or you're going to copy manuscripts. And many of them thought copying a language that you don't even know is better than mucking stables, and so they volunteered. What happened then, it was this explosion of knowledge that occurred with the printing press, because anything that was considered valuable could be mass-produced, and before long in an affordable fashion. And of course, all the students of the printing press say this. Elizabeth Eisenstein, you know, her original 2-volume work is a profound sociology of the printing press and how it altered European structures. Her thesis is, of course, that the laboring class and the ruling class, sort of pitted against one another in European history for many, many years, we're now encountering a third class, the managerial class. So she argues that when you set up a press, you needed to have the workers in their labor away doing their thing, and you need people with capital investment to get the project, and they need managers to manage the people who are making the paper and putting the plates up there and doing so forth, and doing the business arrangements to borrow money and loan money and do these kinds of things. So she argues that it fundamentally changed the nature of European society when you now had 3 classes instead of 2. I mean, it was due to the demand of the printing press that they needed that third category of managerial kinds of people. And then nothing really happens for another 400 or 500 years until the middle of the 19th century. And in the period of 1844 to 1848, you have the period that, it's either 2 periods or 1 period, but it happened at the same time. So you'll notice I use a little backslash there between photography and electricity, because they were the camera, the first photograph, and then the telegraph were invented within, I think, 3 years of each other. And either one of them would have influenced culture as profoundly as the printing press did. And yet they happen at the same moment. So media ecologists don't know whether to say there's 6 moments in media ecology or if there's 5 moments, one of which was a double whammy. But there's no disagreement among us for substance. We just don't know how best to put it, because 2 of those moments happen simultaneously. And they change everything, as we will see, because images appeal to passion and language appeals to reason. At least language can appeal to reason. Now, you can also inflame people, right, with bad rhetoric, as it were. But it is the very nature of image that it arouses passion, but it does not necessarily arouse reason. And that's why Neil Postman, who was himself, a secular Jew, he said, the Almighty prohibited the religious use of images, and I've always thought he was a little narrow on the point, but then Postman goes on to say that he probably knew what he was doing, right? He probably knew exactly what's going on, that the affairs of the soul, the candid recognition that we are in fact sinners, that we are in fact guilty, and we hope someone out there didn't spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. You see, that's a matter of the mind and the soul. And it's the kind of thing where he knew our tendency towards idolatry, to worship and serve the creature, rather than the Creator who's blessed forever. And so he tried to prevent us from getting into trouble that way by saying, let's just not have any religious use of images. They aren't needed. And I can make myself known through baptism and the Lord's Supper, and I don't need anything else. That's plenty. The rest of it's all in here, and that requires thinking and reasoning and wrestling and repenting and all these kind of things for which images just aren't that big of help. So, and then after that, what happens in the digital world is you have a combination of the photographic world and the electronic world, but in a manner that's very, very portable. So some of you, like me, are, shall we say, over 30. I've seen a couple of you out here that are over 30. And some of you, if you're far enough over 30, recall that when you were a child, if there was a television in the house, ordinarily there was just one, and it was plugged into a wall somewhere, and if you had early versions of cable, it was also plugged into the cable, and that's where it sat. And if you had a telephone in your house, it was plugged into a wall somewhere, right? And so if you just avoided the room that had the television and the telephone in it, you were like Dr. King, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. But now, these things hound us like an angry mother-in-law wherever we go, right? There's just, you cannot escape them, right? You cannot run, you cannot hide. In the digital world, because it's so portable, there is no easy way to evade and avoid constant, as we will see, distraction, which is the enemy of executive attention. And so one of the reasons I spend time in the forest, I think it's got some charming realities to it, but there are very few electronic distractions out there. All they have to do is leave this in the Mustang GT or put it on airplane mode, and it just leaves me alone the entire night, right? And so it's worth doing it. I just love the quiet of it. I love the lack of distraction. We get kind of used to hearing sirens, and we get used to horns honking, and the other kind of noises that happen in the suburbs and small towns and so forth. And you go in the forest, and most nights all I'll hear is, there's one owl who doesn't like me, and she lets me know from time to time, but she just hoots from a distance. And recently I haven't heard the coyotes, but for a long time I heard the coyotes with some regularity, and that's a pleasant sound. You know, it's very natural to the woods, and it's a lovely sound to hear. But you don't hear horns honking, you don't hear people with sirens and all that kind of distraction. It's just kind of a neat experience. So what happens now is these things are profoundly alarming. There was only one alarming place in the house that I grew up in, a room that had a telephone in it, and it was adjacent to the room with the television in it. And if you evaded those two rooms, you had quiet anywhere else you wanted to go. And so you did not have to have constant distraction in those days at all. So let me say something about the importance of executive attention. This would be your point 2 and then D towards the bottom of this first page. That a number of people who've discussed human learning have helped us to realize that there's a movement of sort of increasing cognitive activity going on. So many of you have read some of Mortimer Adler's books. I think the best well-known of his is called How to Read a Book. And it's quite thorough. The problem is it's quite thorough. And many people will not spend 250 pages worth of attention reading a book about how to read a book. And so I've often tried to get somebody to write a nice little essay called What I Learned from Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, and put into 25 pages the most important parts that he developed in his. But he also wrote a book called A Guidebook to Learning, in which he traced the history of educational patterns, and he also traced the history of what we would call encyclopedic knowledge. The earliest encyclopedia, how they went about it, how did they develop them. Look at the Encyclopedia Britannica, and you'll notice that it's actually two different encyclopedias, the Macropedia and the Micropedia, they call it. And so the Micropedia looks at very small things briefly, to give you a very thumbnail sketch of them. The Macropedia deals with like a 40-page article on the history of the development of mathematics, right? So you get this huge treatment in multiple columns about the development of mathematics from the ancient world to the present and so forth. They call that the macropedia. And that's because they weren't sure which was more important. The editors of EB thought there's a place for the micropedia, there's a place for the macropedia. They did both. So Adler covered this in his book, A Guidebook to Learning. He covered the history of encyclopedias, and he discussed the history of education. And in that, he described 4 what he calls stages or phases of learning: information, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And he placed them on a continuum because one would lead to the other, ideally. And so information is just when you see something and you recognize it and notice it. So you're out in the backyard with a grandchild or with a nephew or a niece or a son or a daughter, and you see something hopping along, got rather large rear legs and fairly small front ones, greenish, brownish in color and so forth, and you pick it up and it urinates in your hand, and you go, ah, this is a frog, right? Or a toad, right? The frog is amphibian, the toad is not. Otherwise, they look a lot alike, right? They're very, very similar. But just noticing that there's this hopping thing that spoils your hand, that's just information. But then when you find that the frog is like other amphibians, in some sense analogous to a crocodile or an alligator, it has some of the same properties. He says, now you've gone from information to knowledge because you've organized some of your information in a manner that's related to other kinds of information. He calls that knowledge. And then understanding, Adler said, is what can you do with the thing? What are its properties, right? Is it food? Is it shelter? Is it clothing? You can eat frog legs. They're delicious, right? So frog legs are fine for food. The Texans probably make boots out of them. They make boots out of everything, so I wouldn't be surprised if they had some toad skin boots in Texas somewhere. And if you're a clever 8-year-old and you have a 6-year-old sister, you could put a live toad under her pillow before she retires at night and provide amusement for the entire household, right? So you could do lots of different things with a frog, and he calls that understanding. The goal of all learning, he said, however, is wisdom, making the best choices. But you can't do that if you don't understand the properties things have. And it's very difficult to develop understanding until you've grouped things together in related fields of knowledge, right? And the first building block for that is information. And so that's his spectrum of what goes on. So you see, he says all forms of education prior to the 20th century leaned heavily towards wisdom. The goal of all learning was wisdom. And he said, we reached the point where it was just the opposite. And now we have information technologies, you see. And when a college or university devotes millions of dollars each year to information technology, they obviously think information is important, right? And so they're putting their money where their mouth is, right? So they're putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable at that point, you see, because they're emphasizing information as though it were the goal of learning. And if Adler was right, that's only the first step. Our goals to move way beyond information through knowledge to understanding and then wisdom. And wisdom is very, very valuable and very, very hard to get. But the humans have that capacity, and a wonderfully developed executive attention span is an asset to developing understanding and wisdom, of course. And then I have said for years this, what I call a belief spectrum, that we use the word belief to denote what I regard as 4 different things. And I'm not trying to be a grammar cop here, a dictionary cop. I'm not saying it's fine for words to have lots of uses, and that's fine. But I think conceptually we can distinguish a prejudice from an opinion from a belief, from a conviction. And so a prejudice, as the term suggests, is an idea rattling around us in some sense that we may not even be aware of, hence it's prejudice, right? So we say, I think my friend Bob doesn't like black people. And you say, Bob, do you dislike black people? He says, not that I know of. Well, you act like you do, right? You see? That's a prejudice. He's not even aware that he has the tendency. And we call that a prejudice. But then, if you're conscious of the prejudice, if you're aware of it, we might call it an opinion, right? An opinion is something that we're not persuaded is right or wrong. We are aware of it. and that we have lots of hunches that kind of roll around there. I've got one right now for the last year or so. I've been sort of playing with this, sucking on it like a butterscotch, I suppose. I think in the American experiment that slavery created prejudice. Prejudice did not create slavery. What created slavery was the need for a tractor, and we didn't have one until 1871. And so from the time the Hebrews enslaved the Israelites until 1871, if you had a mass agricultural program, so not a small family farm, but a mass agricultural program, you had to have some way of doing that thing. And before diesel and before the tractor, that was slavery. But then if you maltreat people as your servants, you see, for a long enough time, cognitive dissonance will get in there, and you're going to have to justify to yourself how you could treat a fellow human being that way. So I think it was the institution of slavery that created prejudice and racial prejudice. I don't think it was the other way around. But it's just an idea. I haven't read anyone with a brain who agrees with me. I haven't read anyone with a brain who's even thought about it, right? So it's just an idea. It's just an opinion at this point. And I'll probably not even embrace it as true or false. But it's there, and I am aware that I'm wrestling with the question. There you have it. But then there's also belief. And a belief I take as a step further. You are aware of it, like you are when you have an opinion. So you're aware of it, and there's an oughtness to it. That you at least know that someone thinks it ought to be believed. So think of how often we will recite the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed in the liturgy, and then someone will ask us at some point, what about this descended into hell? Right? And we say, well, I'm not real sure. Calvin didn't think it fit very well. Everyone else doesn't think it fits very well. Many communities have omitted the clause, in fact, and it's not in the Nicene Creed. And so the dissensus ad infernum there has been disputed, actually, by theologians for centuries, wondering why it's there and if it's proper or not. But we know we're supposed to believe it because we recite it every week, right? So there can be things in the creed that we say, well, someone thinks we ought to believe this, right? And so there we call that a belief because it's part of the way the Christian tradition has articulated itself. And so we may not be persuaded yet, right? But it's more than just an opinion, just Gordon's crazy idea about slavery and the tractor. It's actually held to by public religions, right? So we call those things beliefs. And then some of us have the leisure in life on occasion to develop a conviction. And to me, a conviction is one of those things where, whether you wanted to believe it or not, the case for it is so overwhelming that it's simply, you're dragged kicking and screaming into believing it. Certain things just seem to be irrefragable. And you embrace them not so much because they have a perfect argument, but that all of the alternatives have a worse argument. So actually I think as I go older, I back into most of the things that I believe. That I start whittling off the things that I think are very poorly reasoned and very little evidence for them. And by default, I end up embracing one that's less bad than the others. And so we call those convictions, where we say, I'm stuck believing this. I don't think I can unbelieve this one. The case for it is too strong to do other. By the way, I feel that way about most of the Federalist Papers. I think if you go back and read the reasoning of Jay and Madison and Hamilton about why the Constitution should have been and was adopted, their reasoning is actually so persuasive it's hard to imagine an alternative that would be any better. And so you say, someone may come up with a better one at some future date, but right now I don't know of another experiment in the governance of unruly humans that is any more likely to work better than this one does. And so all of those things are leaning towards executive attention, which only we humans have. And then, of course, you can see at the bottom of that page that the real problem with the digital technologies is they are public enemy number one to executive attention. Because certain things have to be thought about non-disruptively for a while. We need to focus on them. And when we're constantly being alerted and alarmed, we cannot cultivate in our brains a healthy executive attention span. One of my friends at Westminster Seminary, when I was doing my master's degrees, Hadley, his habit was to always read a book at a single sitting. And he said, now, if it's a larger book, because I think he was working through Kant's several critiques at the time. He said if it's a compelling and difficult work, that sitting may take place over 3 days. It might take you a few days. But his point was, don't read anything else. Don't let anything interrupt it. If you put your mind, if you fasten onto it, right, like a household dog on the leg of a mailman, right? If you fasten onto this thing, right, you want to hold on to it until you get to the end of it. And what you do is you prohibit your brain from being distracted in an intentional fashion. And that's why Hadley wasn't the only one that said that. There are many people who have always said you should read a book at a sitting. Even if that sitting takes place over several days, their point was, don't let other things impede and get in the way of your thoughtfulness. Focus on the thing and stay with it. And I think there's something to be said for that. So if the brain is constantly having to adjust to alarms, it becomes very good at alarming attention and less good at executive attention. It's just the trade-off that we have to do. And so the primary virtue of digital technologies is their speed, right? That we can send and receive messages to people very, very quickly. But their primary virtue is not that they cultivate wisdom. They tend to get in the way of it as well. So they are literally alarming, as you know, and they cultivate a distracted brain. So then let me suggest there, this is my fourth point, a major point then anyway, by injuring executive attention, digital technologies tend to erode intelligence itself. And I've noticed in recent years, hence the bibliography, that a new field of studies is apparently developing. I inelegantly refer to it as stupid studies. Someone's going to have to come up with a more elegant title for it. But all of these are not just general works on media ecology. These that I've included here are people talking about the apparent evidence that we're becoming stupider, right? The titles themselves are a tad alarming on most of these, right? They're certainly not flattering to our species. When Daniel Ariely wrote Predictably Irrational, he said we're not merely predicting that people will be irrational, we can predict how they will be irrational. And that's what the field of behavioral economics does. So his example that I recall is, you go in to get a 10-ounce can of plum tomatoes in the grocery store, and you notice that one of them's $1.20, the other one's, let's say, 89 cents, and one of them's 46 cents. He says, we've actually done this from time to time with the help of the graduate students, the modern equivalent of slave labor, they put them loose on it, and they say, this one says canned in Michigan. This one's canned in Michigan. This one's canned in Michigan. He says, well, sometimes when we see these things like this, right, they're all canned in Ann Arbor, Michigan. How many canneries can there be in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right? And then they find out, after doing some research, that they were all canned in the same place. And 3 different labels were put on them. And he says, we can predict that 80% of people will buy the middle-priced one, that about 10% each will get the most expensive and the least expensive. People who are very cost-conscious will also say, there's probably not a great deal of difference, I'm going to get the less expensive. And then other people say, nothing's too good for my family, right? And they will always buy the most expensive one on the theory. He says, we can predict that that's true for virtually everything you put in your shopping basket. Isn't that amazing? He says, so let's say it's a 35-cent difference. No big deal, right? What if there's 100 things in your basket? What if you go twice a week? Now it's 100 times 35 cents, right? Twice a week, 200 times 35 cents, right? That does make a difference. And so he says, we can predict, human nature being human nature, that people will do this with virtually everything in the entire store. So we not only predict that humans, he says, will be irrational, we can predict the manner of their irrationality. So that's a very disturbing / interesting book to read. He's an interesting person. He's at Duke. He's a native Israeli, and worth reading. And of course, Mark Bauerlein's written 2 books, The Dumbest Generation, How the Digital Age Stupefies Young Americans, and then more recently, The Dumbest Generation Grows Up. And when I saw the title of the newer one, I thought, oh, good, he's changed his mind. They've grown up. And he says, no. They're not less dumb. He says, now they can vote. So that's all he meant by the dumbest generation grows up. Not that they grew up and became more mature, but now the rascals are electing people who govern us, the people who tax us, fine us, incarcerate us, and execute us, right? And now this dumb generation is participating in the electoral process. So if you read that, just get used to the fact that you probably won't sleep well for a day or two. So Nicholas Carr wrote that wonderful essay in Atlantic years ago, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" and it came out later in book form. You know, Atlantic does this every now and then. They give people a 30 or 40 page chance to present a précis of a book that's already in the process of being published, and it's good for the people to decide, now I do or do not want to read the whole book when it comes out. So you'll see that Nicholas Carr has done that. Jonathan Haidt's written several things. This summer, his book, The Anxious Generation, came out. And earlier, he and Greg Lukianoff had written The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. That very, very disturbing thing for parents or would-be parents to read. And Alan Jacobs, I think it's his most recent book. You know, Alan Jacobs, I used to tell the students, Alan Jacobs only writes about one thing: life. That's all the man writes about. He has a book on the Book of Common Prayer. He has an entire book on original sin. He has the theology of reading, a hermeneutics of love, in which he talks about a Christian, distinctly Christian way to read. Really fascinating what Alan Jacobs does. But in his book, How to Think, it's not, as the title might suggest, how to think. It's a description of what things prevent us from doing so well. And so he said there's an enormous aspect of the sociology of knowledge that we want to be these people or we do not want to be these people. He calls them the repugnant cultural other, the RCO, the repugnant cultural other. And he says many of the opinions that we articulate as holding are only held because we want to make sure people don't think we are these people. And he said no unbiased seeker of truth would ever assume that I'll just run from certain people and therefore distance myself from them intellectually. What if a repulsive person believes a true thing? That's no reason not to believe something if it might be true. That's just not, he says, that's not how the mind should work. So in the book he talks about some of his friends internationally, because he has friends who are atheists. Of course, he's quite an Orthodox Christian. He has friends who are atheists, he has friends who are agnostic, he has people who embrace a different religion than Christianity and so forth. He says, I can't call them like-minded friends because we believe different things, but they are like-hearted friends, because we all in our own way have been looking to find truth for years and years and years. And we can tell in conversations with one another that that's what we're about. So he says, I call them like-hearted because they seem to be sincerely in the quest of truth. And he says, I think I am. I think I'm sincerely involved in that quest too. So all sorts of people are writing about the current situation where, not surprisingly, the digital technologies with their alarming tendencies appear to be eroding executive attention span. That's a substantial number of books to have been written within a decade, from people in different disciplines, different parts of the country and so forth, all observing a very similar thing happening. And of course, they're just the annual tests where you can see what reading level do people read at. And there was a story, I guess, in the Free Press recently about a young man who had graduated with honors from his high school, and he couldn't read. He was illiterate. He couldn't read see spot run, run spot run, and they gave him a degree. So he and his family are thinking of suing the school system. Right? How can you keep passing a person who hasn't developed one of the most fundamental building blocks of learning, which is the capacity to read? It's just a terribly sad circumstance that is the case. COVID made it worse, as you know, because for many students, they lost effectively 2 years of their cognitive and emotional development. And poor hapless educators now are trying to figure out what to do with that. I escaped just in time. I think I retired in 2021 when we were just seeing the influx of people who'd been kind of robbed of much of their high school learning. And as college professors, we didn't know, do we maintain the standards of Grove City College and keep being demanding, or do we show compassion towards these people because it's not their fault, right? And everyone I talk with who's in higher education now says they're wrestling with the same thing. We don't want to penalize them for something that they weren't responsible for, but we don't want to give an engineer a degree and have him drop a bridge into the Allegheny River, right? So that's a real issue, right? And we also want our brain surgeons to be able to say, scalpel, please, instead of saying, give me that thingamabob over there, right? When we're unconscious on the table and our life is in someone else's hands, we want them to know what they're doing, right? We're not being nitpicky at that point. We just want to see our relatives again. We want to come out of the surgery and still be alive. Well, I've raced you through what I regard as 4 significant aspects of media ecology with an emphasis on executive attention span and the way our media are getting in the way. And so I thought I would entertain a question or two. The powers that be say it's okay to have some Q&A period. By the way, at the very top, see my name and you see my email address? I'm looking for distractions. No, I'm not looking for distractions. But sometimes when you hear a public lecture, you think about something while you're driving home, or the next day when you're washing dishes, right? Or showering or shaving or whatever it is you're doing. And then you recall a question you would have asked if you thought about it. Just email me, and somewhere in it indicate that you were here on this night and heard this, and that's what's causing your question. And I'll do my best to answer it. You may have questions about other bibliographic matters, and I can recommend books to you that you might have an interest in, that sort of a thing.
So I've heard consistently the same question being asked, which is, how did we get where we are today? And what I'm hearing you say is, this is at least part of the explanation, is that we are seeing a diminution of executive function. And that's why we have people believing stuff that is just error.
Yes.
They believe with conviction.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah, and I would protect my term conviction and say they say it with enthusiasm or vigor, but I think they're not really convinced, right? But yeah, I think that the capacity to reason your way to a justified conclusion is rarer. Marcus Aurelius, in the 2nd century or so, said, you always have the option of having no opinion.
Some people don't exercise.
Right. And Thomas Jefferson, for all of his voluminous correspondence, he only wrote the one book, Notes on the State of Virginia. And that was for his European friends to let them know what we were experiencing here in the colonies, and especially in his native and my native Virginia. And at some point, he was wrestling with the fact that down in South America, in the Andes range, they had found marine fossils at 14,000 feet elevation. And so they're trying to figure, how do we have seashells at 14,000 feet, right? And these were in sufficient numbers. It wasn't like some child walked up there and dropped one. Right? And so he said there are 3 ways to date of accounting for this. Now, he's living before the idea of plate tectonics, right? So the idea of plate tectonics was unknown to Jefferson and to anyone in his generation. And so as he rehearsed the 3 views, he said, they're all 3 manifestly wrong. None of the proposals will withstand scrutiny. And he said, he is closer to truth who has no opinion than he who has an erroneous opinion. So his view was very much like Marcus Aurelius's, right? That if there's not a sufficient ground to have an opinion, just don't have one. It's fine to have no opinion. And so, I think that the more significant a matter is, it might be that it's more important to give attention to it and frame an opinion. I'm obviously much more interested at this point in the history of human governance and in the biblical theology. I've lectured on Genesis 9 and Romans 13 publicly. I think I've written a 30-page paper on it, in fact. So I'm very interested in the history of human experiments in government, and have probably read 50 to 75 books on the founding of the nation or the first 4 presidents, either the biologies of those early the Band of Brothers kind of a group, you know. So I'm very, very fascinated in the formation of our own republic as well, and its roots in the others. And I let other people argue about what happened yesterday. On this, I'm still convinced by Thoreau. Thoreau said, "Read not the times," referring to the New York. "Read not the times, read the eternities." And so the news industry wants us to think that we have to know all sorts of trivial things that happened in the last 24 hours, and yet we've never read the Federalist Papers. We have no idea why the Constitution was designed as it is and why Jay and Madison and Hamilton defended it on the grounds they did. But if you're going to be an American citizen for 50, 60, 70 years in your adult life, why not understand your own republic? Because many of the things that you'll see now, if you listen to talking heads on the internet or television, they're upset about either one or more of the three branches of government for how they are helping or resisting Mr. Trump. And in none of those conversations will you hear people saying they're supposed to get in each other's way. That's what the founders designed. We wanted each of these branches of government to check the other so it didn't become a runaway train. And so we're just now seeing a republic being healthy. We're seeing executive orders be given, and someone files an injunction, and the judge agrees and issues a stay, which says until there's a hearing, we're not going to do anything with this, right? That it's outside of the prerogative of the executive branch to do that. And so that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to make sure that each of them stays in its own lane, as it were. And whereas I think we live in a moment where people want to have an opinion about every particular aspect of it, and they don't have any fundamental underlying understanding of how a democratic republic is supposed to function. Oh no, we're not going to let him ask questions.
All right, so this is, I guess it's a little bit of a statement off of what you had said that kind of leads to a question with regard to how we think through it. But I think like one of the things that, you know, just through what you had shared in kinds of conversations and engaging in this, it's like the word that I see coming through is the aspect that like oftentimes as Christians, we've been wired to think only about the content. And so like, you know, it's like, well, for a long time, like around in the 90s, like, we'll worry about video games because they were bad video games.
Right.
Like, the reality is that the medium itself is shaping us. And so, you know, I think that that's one of the things I think is valuable is thinking through not just the content, but even how the medium through which it's coming is shaping and forming us. So I know, like with my boys, one of the things dealing with is that even, like of course, if you're looking at illicit content, it's going to be harmful on multiple levels. But even if you're just looking at kittens and puppy dogs, the idea of swiping constantly is still shaping and forming us in a certain way. And it might be shaping us and forming us in a way that we don't want to be formed and make us unable to engage and hear from God in a manner that is more normative into like Christ likeness. But so taking that to the church, the challenge is that's a reality for all mediums. So like because famously Socrates didn't want to write anything because the medium was not a proper form as opposed to conversation because dialogue was better than reading. And so even like reading itself is going to impact how we engage in everything else. So what are your thoughts? Because naturally within the society that we live in, to be even engaged within that society, kind of like the tool shapes the society. So we've created cell phones, and now cell phones have made themselves necessary for us to be engaged within our society in many different ways. So as we're engaging within that, especially as a church, how do we what's the process of thinking through any of the technologies and how we're using them to communicate the gospel, how we're using them to teach and to communicate Christians to be thinking wisely about media and how it's being utilized in our Christian life, in our worship, in our engagement with each other.
The most significant of the early works by Marshall McLuhan that sort of introduced the whole idea was entitled Understanding Media, Extensions of Man. And so, understanding media. So, if we mentioned earlier the progression from knowledge, information to knowledge, to understanding to wisdom, before we are wise, we have to understand, and to understand what things do, what their likely influence is on us. Then we can begin to make decisions about what to do with which ones. So, by the way, Socrates had two objections to writing, and they were both valid. Whether they warrant our never reading or writing again is to me another. He said, first of all, in contrast to conversation, there can't be any give and take in which you can ask a question and a person can respond. He said, if I read a sentence in your manuscript and I don't understand it and I ask it a question, it just repeats itself, right? That's what he actually said. He's kind of clever about it. You know, it just says what it already said. You didn't understand what it already said. Now you ask it a question and it doesn't answer at all, he says. And so he said the other thing is that it will tend to erode memory because it will be easy to write things down and not have to develop the mnemonic abilities to have a better recall. So I think on the second point, he was nearly entirely right. The history of the printing press has quite often led to the decline of memory. The exception is people who memorize poetry from time to time and that sort of a thing. They deliberately wrap themselves in a book and memorize things that way. But I think he overlooked that a good author could anticipate questions and objections ahead of time and write in such a way that he would be understood. So you think of the Apostle Paul, you're reading along in Paul, and he says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Well, of course not, you see. So he's anticipating, isn't he, Eric, at that point? He's anticipating that someone might become a licentious person because he's talked about free grace, and so he raises the question himself. So I think skilled authors are more competent than Socrates imagined that they could be, evading and avoiding some of that. But yeah, I think that there is a certain amount of memory loss. And our recording devices, for instance, I'm fairly sure that my phone would allow me to record a message of some sort, like a reminder. Or probably you could talk to it. And if not, I could ask Siri to talk to it for me, I suppose. But what I found through the years, and the neurological studies I think prove this, is when you write something down, your recall of that thing later is so profoundly different from whether you just hear it or even if you type it on a keyboard. Because when you write, it's almost like surgery. Think of how fine it is. So the neuromotor part of the brain is profoundly active when you write a thing down. So when I read books, one of the things I learned from Adler, is you have your marginal notes, just your own little shorthand. And for me, one of my shorthand things is B. If I put a B in the margin, that means bibliography. That means here's a book or an article that I haven't read that I want to put on my list, and I'll go back later when I finish reading the book, run through and find the B's, right? And the other thing is I often put in the margin Q, and for me that means quote. And that's the things where a person has succinctly or with real elegance expressed a thing well. And then I go back and I write those quotes into a commonplace book. And sometimes 3 years later, I can be talking with someone and repeat almost verbatim one of those quotes, which never happens when I write it down on a laptop. Never. Almost literally never. And so if we understand how the neuromotor portion works with recall, we will choose to have a few notebooks sitting around that we write in from time to time, because the things we write in there, we learn. If I'm trying to memorize a poem, for instance, one of the things I do is I write it down a number of times, right? I probably get 15 or 20 pages of my copying down Tennyson's poem Ulysses some years ago. Just keep writing it down, and now I got through 14 lines before I made a mistake. Then I made 16 lines before I made a mistake, and right? And eventually you've got all 79, 77 lines, whatever it is, and you've got it. So it requires, Eric, understanding, and that's why that book was so important. The title of McLuhan's first book, Understanding Media, Extensions of Man, he was asking the question, which of our various humane properties is extended, right, the way a telescope extends the eye, right? He was asking these kinds of questions. And it seems to me we cannot make wise decisions about media until we understand their properties. And by the way, one of the things I can send you, like I said, this little group of books here, that's probably less than 1/10 of my media ecology syllabus. And it's not copyrighted, and I'm happy to send it as an email attachment to any of you. And it's also annotated, so most of the things that are in there, I have a sentence or two explaining what it is. And you might find that there are certain things addressing precisely things. So Tony Reinke, is on the staff of the church out there where John Piper is. And about 4, 5, 6 years ago, he wrote a book called 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. And he had done real good work with the available literature at the time. And you go through there and you realize we have documentable evidence now for what's going on. Now, interestingly, because of the consumer pushback, your newer versions of your smartphones have a number of apps and utilities in there that help you tame them a little bit. Mine will tell me how much I used it yesterday. And I can say, okay, buddy, you're over your limit. Right? Whatever that might be. And airplane mode can prevent it from going off in church and embarrassing everyone and irritating the pastor, right? So that tames it. And there are ways of requiring double authentication to do things and so forth. So the industry itself, I think, is aware of the fact that we're like the actor on the old movie, was it Network? Was it Albert Finney? Who comes in on a rainy, he comes into the television studio, it's a news studio, and he throws the window open and yells out into the dark New York street with all the rain pelting down. He says, "We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore," right? It's just a wild scene, and he really pulls it off. I mean, it sends chills down the thing, But he was tired of the manipulative media in his day, which was television, right? And so it was a very, very fascinating thing. So I think you almost have to reach a point where you say, look, everyone, there's this whole field that I now call stupid studies. Everyone's writing about how much dumber we are than a generation and a half ago. And so, we have to figure out the way these things influence us. You can make a hole with a shovel, and you can make calluses with the shovel. But if you use a shovel, you will be different than if you didn't use the shovel. Everything we use. If we were not material beings, this would not be the case. But we are material beings, and God put us in a material world, and so our interaction with that material world always affects us one way or the other. So when the students used to think I was crazy to go into forest, they said, "Isn't it cold out there?" I said, "It's real cold at times." "Isn't it wet out there?" "It's real wet at times." "Isn't it muddy out there?" "It's real muddy at times," right? And I'd go through this for a while and then finally say, "By the way, it's also really real." It's also really real. And then they looked at me like, "He's got 3 heads." Right? They couldn't process at all because they're so used to living in a non-real that they don't know what you do. They also used to always ask 2 questions. They were surprised to find that I'd go to the forest alone at night. And one of them was, "What about the bears?" And I'd say, "Well, they're just going to have to get used to it." Then they'd say, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I don't take a smartphone or anything like that, so I normally sit in front of the fire and drink Earl Grey tea." And for them, the notion that you would sit there from 7 p.m. till 11 p.m. without any other stimulation than the fire was just incomprehensible, right? They just couldn't imagine that anyone could do that. When it's not that hard, you just sit down. Sitting comes pretty easy to you after you've done it for years. After 70 years of practice sitting, I've gotten awfully good at it.
So aside from
projecting ahead to the, okay, what do we do about it? Because we put some limits on it. You know, we can try to convince people to put their phone on silent when they go to bed, whatever. But the ship's already sailed, right? I mean, it's only, if anything, accelerating. So practical, pastoral, parenting advice that you would say, try to do this, do more of this, whatever, in order to counteract, in order to lessen the harm, or even move in the right direction. What comes to mind?
Remember in his Republic that Plato argued that philosophers should govern. He said the wisest people should govern. Why should the people who are less wise govern? Shouldn't the wisest govern, right? That was the context of the allegory of the cave, because they said, you know, if a person's been out and seen the light, why would he go back in the darkness? And so his point was, well, out of compassion for others, to bring them into the light. Because they were saying, why would someone who's done philosophy stoop to something is degraded as governing other humans? It's like herding cats. And he said, but it's also like going into the cave to get them out. I still think he's right. I think it seems to me inarguable. It's a conviction that the wiser members of a culture should govern the culture. And my mild optimism on the matter is the handful of conscientious parents who will encourage better habits in their home and with their kids are going to run circles around everyone else's kids in the future. And that means the wise will rule. So I have no hopes for a group about whom the apostle said, let God be true, though every man be a liar. So until he returns and the sheep and the goat are separated for eternity, it seems to me that we live in a world in which there are large numbers of people making terribly bad choices. But I think that Christian parents rearing their children in a good Christian environment and being concerned for their social, emotional, and cognitive development will actually find that their children will run circles around the others in the future and will become leaders, and that's what we want. My other consolation is from an obscure religious figure in the first century who said, enter by the narrow way, because the way is wide and the path is easy that leads to destruction, and those who find it are many. But the way is narrow and the path is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. So I don't think it's ever been the case that the large numbers of people walked the right path.
Thinking about what Charlie Kahn said back in January in our first session, and thinking about how this impacts church life, it's been a conviction of mine for years that if we lean into authenticity, into real relationships, into real conversations and togetherness, that as time goes, as this generation, comes to adulthood, who primarily interact on the phone, that we will have something that their soul desperately craves, because they were made for that. That was his point, and I think it dovetails brilliantly with your point about the media itself. None of this is authentic.
Right.
Likes and comments and shares and whatnot. It's not authentic human interaction.
Yeah, it's not even human interaction with the created order when I'm out in the woods and it's dark and it's damp and it's muddy, right? And that sort of a thing. But it's all real, right? It's actually real. We've got a few places in that forest. It was all harvested for wood years ago, I'm sure. But there's a few places on the steep slopes that go down to Denison Run and Bullion Run and down to the Allegheny, where apparently it was too steep for them to log it at one point. So down there you have hemlocks this big around, And I look at at a hemlock like that and I say, that was here probably before my great-great-great-great-grandfather was alive, and it's still there. So it's really real. It's extremely real. And you see that when you're in a forest that still has some old growth here and there, little things that remind you that, think of all the people that have come and go and the people that used to log out there, and they did some other industrial things, the iron furnace where they melted iron ore. Think of all the folks that have gone through there, and some of these trees were there before any of that. they were there. So there's something that's very rooted and real about everything out there. And there's very little of the transient in the forest. In fact, if you get off trail, I'm fairly comfortable doing that now. If you're off trail, then you can almost fool yourself into thinking that you're in a remote place. Because there's many places where you see no evidence of human handiwork. Not a trail, not a trail sign, right? Nothing. And the forest looks the way it probably would have looked before the Civil War. So there's a certain kind of enduring permanence to the created order. And people who appreciate that created order and the God who made it, I think that they will become different people. And that's why I think in the future we may see that a return to Plato's wished situation when the wisest people ruled us instead of the least wise. But for no other reason than they're going to pass on all their tests higher. They're going to score higher on every measurable way. If they've developed a decent executive attention span, they will do well. Our son-in-law, not the one that I was hiking with recently, but the other one, who's the father of our 3-month-old granddaughter, he's only been with Accutronic full-time for 2 years, graduated from Pitt 2 years ago, but he was an intern with Accutronic in Pittsburgh before that. So they just put in a bid for a contract of some sort with SpaceX. And Josh has already been told that if they win the bid, he's going to be the manager. He's been there for 2 years. And they must think the boy has his wits about him, because if they're going to do something with Musk, that's a high statement of confidence in a young man after 2 years to say, if we win this bid, we want you to run the project. So I think you notice in any arena in life people who have a strong work ethic, who have a compassionate awareness of others and their heartaches and their sadnesses and their injuries and so forth, who have a stick-wittedness to them when they settle in on something, they pursue it until they get to the end of it. And before long, these quality people, some of that cream rises to the top. And if it does, it just means that what Plato thought would be best would be that the wisest rule us. And if that's what happens, that's good. Yeah, and he started with a small group. I mean, other than sending out the 70, but a group of 12 and 3 in the inner circle from that 12. And so you don't need too many good people to make an enormous difference. You do need some. You'll also notice that in his conversations, and this was true of his apostles, one of the most frequent little expressions in the New Testament is gegraptai. It is written. It's like 74 times. It's just the perfect passive of grapho. Gegraptai. It is written. And so note then, he did have a healthy respect for the Old Testament writings and quite often cited them. And so the God who prohibited the religious use of images, when he incarnated in the person of his Son, isn't it interesting that he cited as authority these authoritative religious writings, right? So he had no problem with language, right? And he had no problem with written language. And he was terribly skilled in his use of language. And so we sometimes forget that. In the Psalms, one of the things we miss, of course, in English is because you can't transfer the art of Hebrew poetry into English always, because sometimes the assonance or the alliteration that's lovely in the Hebrew is just not there. Fortunately, the primary literary device in the Psalms is parallelism, where the second line restates a previous line in some way, whether it's an antithetic parallelism as in Psalm 2, or whether it's a more synthetic parallelism or synonymous parallelism and so forth. That's still preserved. But when you look at the first psalm, for instance, and it begins, Ashrei Ha'ish Asher, the first three words of the first psalm all begin with the first letter, the Aleph of the Hebrew alphabet. They all three have a shin, the penultimate letter in Hebrew, Ashrei, Ish, Asher. And two of the three have the Rosh, the R, Ashrei, Ha'ish, Asher, right? It probably took 50 years to figure that out, right? Because then any attentive child would say, blessed is the man who what, right? You've got the kid's attention. It's been said artfully, blessed is the one who. And it says, walks not here, sits not there, right? So you're expecting it to, who does this, but it's saying, who doesn't do this, right? Sort of a fascinating thing. There's no way to preserve those kinds of beauties in English, but when you study them, you realize that the Holy Spirit, unsurprisingly, loved to adorn things. He loved to adorn truth with beauty. He just loved to do so. And it's not surprising because the garden was both practical and beautiful, and really not in that order. It was beautiful then practical, right? It's pleasing to the eyes and good for food. So it's both lovely and life-sustaining. And so the God who made the world gave it useful properties, utilitarian properties, but he gave it also aesthetic properties, made it beautiful. And it's not surprising then that the psalmist says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. Because so many of the psalms are apples of gold in settings of silver because they're so literarily apt. Yeah, they're beautiful. But developing the sensibility to notice the beauty and see how it works is something that we're probably losing. When I wrote Why Johnny Can't Preach, the media have shaped the messengers 10 years ago now, maybe more. It was obviously media ecologically informed. And I was suggesting that as education has moved further and further away from what we used to call the language arts and more into the maths and the sciences, then it's difficult for a seminary in 3 years to train a young man to preach. It'd be like training a dachshund to speak French, right? It's just a little over their head because they haven't the literary capacities that earlier generations all had. And so it's a trade-off that we've had to have made. But in 1941, at the annual lectures at Princeton Seminary, Charles Grosvenor Osgood gave a series of addresses that were later published under the title how did he put it, poetry as a means of grace. He didn't argue technically that there were means of grace like preaching, prayer, or the ordinances of the Lord's Supper and baptism. But he said, your English is informed by all the English you're exposed to. And if yours is an oral thing, communication-wise, why not devote a lot of your time to people who loved the way our language sounded? Read your Wordsworth, read your Coleridge, right? Read Thomas Gray, read these people. And he said, if you're a lifelong reader of poetry, this will influence your diction, it will influence your cadences, and you won't realize it. It'll just naturally come out because it shaped your sensibilities. So when people are playing computer games rather than reading Shakespeare's sonnets, and then they get to seminary and the seminary tries to turn that person into a preacher. Well, you can learn a lot about reading scripture carefully by reading poetry carefully, right? You read a good poem, and you always start with the assumption I do, which is there was nothing on this piece of paper at one point. And then George Herbert wrote The Pulley, or whatever the particular poem was. And then you're trying to say, what's every line of this poem doing? And how would the poem be different if this weren't there? And so to cultivate that kind of sensibility for language and how it works has enormous potential consequences. And remember, these lectures were given in 1941, and the television wasn't invented until almost 1950. So he was telling Princeton students, 8 years before the television was even invented, not to watch it. Right? He said, be a lifelong reader of poetry, because the people who devoted themselves to the way our language sounds, they will influence your ability to read carefully and sensibly, and they will enhance your own diction, because you'll have all of their wealth of refined sensibility built up within you. And to think that he said this 8 years before television was even invented, still telling seminary students then, read poetry. Spend a decent amount of your free time reading poetry. It's a remarkable thing. So when I mentioned that reading poetry is good for preachers, I was so glad when I finally found his book, Poetry as a Means of Grace. Because I said, look, this was said 75 years ago. This is not me just being cranky because of the digital stuff. This was said a long time ago, right? And I didn't invent it, but I was saying it for 2 or 3 years before I ran across his book in a used bookstore, and then said, someone said this in 1941. Yeah. Well, thank you for your kind attention, and thanks for putting up with my imperfect lecture. If you have questions of a follow-up nature, my email's on there. I'll just won't allow it to alarm me. I'll just check it once or twice a day. Thanks very much for having me.